I'm delighted to be talking to Sarah Wayland in Sydney, Australia. Sarah is a researcher who's done a lot of work about hope and its context with missing people and families that are left behind. So, Sarah, would you like to just say a little bit more about your
Sure, I
background?
will. Thanks, Sarah. And I should say probably good evening and good morning, depending on what time zone we're in. That's true. I am a missing persons researcher with a special interest in ambiguous loss. So I've been working in the missing persons field in Australia since 2004. I think I always grew up with a keen interest in missing persons cases, and after having a number of family members myself who disconnected from the family, not necessarily went missing, but disconnected, I think that my social work career kind of pushed me in that direction. And so since 2004, I went from providing counselling to families of missing people, and then moving on to manage the Victims of Crime Bureau for New South Wales Government. And then, and a little puppy dog in the background. And then, since 2012, I've been working with the University of New England as a researcher in the School of Health, and I'm just about to graduate with my doctorate, exploring the complexity of hope when someone is missing long term. So that's me.
Well, that's amazingly relevant to what we're going to look at the Family Forum Day. Hope has been one of those emotions that I've looked at a lot over the 23 years that I've had a missing
Yes.
son, and I think what struck me is how complex it is and how the subtle variations over the years. And one of the quotes that I saw not long ago was I can't remember what context this quote
Yep.
came from. It's the possibility that keeps me going, not the guarantee. And I think that is very relevant to hope, because while you can hope, there is always that possibility. But how did you find, talking to families, that hope does change or does affect
Sure.
people? And what ways do you see that happening?
What I found was I had 19 participants in my study, and it was a narrative inquiry qualitative study. So, really, that just means, in layperson's terms, I asked people to tell me the stories of hope since their person went missing. So, the 19 participants stretched from having someone missing 9 months up until 34 years. So, I had a real breadth of experience in terms of trying to understand those little nuances of hope. Because as you'd imagine, when I started to collect the literature was in two places. One was about what does it mean to have someone missing, but more in a global sense about hope. What does hope actually mean? Because I think naively I thought, you know what, I can probably do this study and at the end I'll have a very nice, neat definition of what hope is. And quite quickly I worked out that that wasn't going to happen. But what I found was that hope had almost like these intangible qualities, that it was a term that we used in everyday life, but more specifically when someone was missing, right from the get-go, we talked about this narrative of hope, but that what we were hoping for seemed to be that subtle shift over time. And what I found from the
Mm.
participants was that some people spoke about this idea of course, the person would be found, that there wasn't even necessarily a need to hope because they just perceived that if someone vanished, that someone would find them. And that's just how it worked in the universe. And once they started to realize that their worldview had shifted because they realized that no matter how much energy they threw at this, that they couldn't find the person, then it became about these different shades of hope. And like you said before, like 50 Shades of Hope, which is actually something that I was thinking of a few months ago, thinking if I could turn my PhD into a book, maybe I could call it 50 Shades of Hope and people would buy it.
Really?
Yes.
Oh,
And I
that's
love that bit
really
of
good. Yeah,
synchronicity. But what I
yeah.
found was that, because everyone always says, well, what did I find out in my study? And there wasn't a magical answer at the end. But what I found was that hope had two streams, and that as time shifted, it became less about hope for the physical return of the missing person. And for many people, particularly 10 to 15 years after the person vanished, a real sense of hope for the self. So, hope for their own capacity to live with not knowing, and hope for themselves to have some power to be able to tolerate not knowing. And particularly that was in the case of older participants who were starting to ponder, what if I live out the rest of my days and I never know what happened? How am I going to wrestle with that? How am I going to sit with that? And for them, hope then became softer, whereas in the earlier days it was more poignant. It was a sharper type of hope. but it became softer over time, and they could learn to sit with it.
Yeah, I can relate to all of that. And I think what I've also seen, both in my own case and talking to other families, other family members, hope, as well as being a positive emotion that can help you sit with the living in limbo scenario, it can also be a negative emotion because it can trap people if they hold on to perhaps what we would say is unreasonable hopes. It can sort of trap them in a situation
Exactly.
where they can't actually move forward with their lives, and that's pretty tricky
It
too.
is.
Did you see
I
that as?
definitely found that. And what I found in speaking to people was that there was a definite distinction between that practical engagement with hope around engaging with law enforcement or the coroner's office or legal requirements or any other situations that made people reach out for help. But then there was also that emotional help. And so I guess in terms of talking about that here, it might be interesting for the participants at your forum to think about, well, who enables their hope and who detracts from their hope. Sadly, most of the participants said that the police were the number one people that made them feel like they had to give up their hope, even though there was no reasonable news that suggested to them that they had to, even if it was years and years down the track. But the people that allowed them to hold on to hope were the ones that were around them who identified that there'd be shifting in and shifting out concepts of what they were hoping for. There was also a definite one participant, and I just loved some of the words that people shared with me, in terms of trusting me and giving me all of this information, was that they said that they felt a form of a hope hangover. That as anniversaries would come up or significant dates or news in the media or whatever, that their hope would increase. And then that moment where they found that nothing was happening, that hope hangover in the days and the months and the weeks after that meant that they felt like someone had pulled that hope rug out from underneath them. And it took them a long time to get back on top of it. But that as time went on, people weren't open to hearing their public stories of hope. And so those stories became very private. And they were sometimes ones that people only told themselves, that they didn't feel it was safe to tell the media that they were still holding on to hope, even though they knew that people might perceive it to be false. They just, some of the participants said to me, I can't give up hope on the child that I gave birth to, because to give up on hope is to give up on them. And it's just not possible for me. And I'm okay with that, but I don't trust anyone anymore with those thoughts. I don't tell that to people because they want me to tie it up in a neat little ribbon and put it aside and say, you know what, they're never going to come back. And I don't necessarily think that all of the discussions are about hoping for the person to come back, but just hoping to perhaps learn that the world is a completely different way than how they intended it might be, and kind of trying to be okay with that.
I think after a certain period of time and years, everybody will vary as to what that period of time is. You almost lose track of what you're hoping for, because like you say, it's not necessarily that the person is going to return unharmed or whatever, but it's almost like, what am I hoping for? And you can't verbalize that.
With the participants, I managed to draw a bit of a diagram, and I'll send that to you for you to share. I'll try and splice it in while we're talking, but if I can't work out how to do that, I'll send it to you. But I developed something called the shared hope zone, which was about hope for the missing person and hope for the self, and that at different times, sometimes they overlapped and sometimes they were very separate, but that it was almost like a moving out and coming back in together over and over again. And it was really just that person's own individual journey with learning to live with having someone who was missing, rather than what society thinks we should be doing, or how we should be behaving, or what our spiritual needs are, or what our religion says, or what the police say to us, or what our counsellor tells us that we have to do. That it really became a story that we just told ourselves rather than needing to be told by other people.
And did you find in talking to family members that, as you say, it's an individual story, and I think even within families, and I'm pretty sure this is the same in my family, each member, and my son has 3 sisters and 2 step siblings, And I think each of us has our own story on what we think, what we hope
Yes.
for. And it is very private. You don't actually talk about it much, even within the
Yes.
family, in my
Yes,
case.
definitely. And it was interesting to note that some of my participants were related to each other, but that they didn't know that there were other family members within the participant group that they knew of. So it was a nice perspective for me to be able to sit outside of that and listen to those stories and see the different places that people were, even though they might be perceived to be on the same journey. But that the outcomes for people in terms of learning how to live well with not knowing, even though that sounds like a little bit like an oxymoron, that you should learn to live well in the midst of all of that, what I found was people coped better when families gave each other permission to be on different pages. If there was an expectation that everyone should toe the same line, then that meant that those private narratives became even more private and a little bit shameful as well, that they were feeling something different to what the other family members were feeling. You know, and I think that's what we don't talk up about often enough. When we talk about families of missing people, we almost should be talking about individuals who have someone that's missing, and sometimes pare it back a little bit more and look at us as individual beings. It's not one collective group that's hoping for the return of the missing person. It's each of our little threads that pull us towards someone rather than a group context.
Yeah, no, that is an important factor, because a mother or father will feel or a mother feels differently from a father, who feels differently from a sibling, who feels differently from an aunt and uncle
Yes,
or
yes,
grandparent,
yes.
whatever. And while initially, when the first shock of somebody going missing sort of pulls you all together into a crisis group,
Yeah,
as it were, as the months and years tick by, it does become a different story for
it
each of us,
does.
and how we deal with it is
Yeah, and how we
different.
honour those stories and whether or not people are even invited to tell those stories. I mean, for the families that I had as part of the study that were further down the track, they said that when the media contacted them, they were just still asked the same questions all of the time. Do you still think they're out there? What will you do if they come home? Rather than talking about those really complex issues of public health matters out there in the community, about what happens for people who are unwell from an emotional health perspective, what's the impact on us in terms of unresolved grief and how we function as human beings. Sometimes when we talk about missing, people said they felt that the identity of the person was lost, and all people were interested in was the fact that they were missing, that there wasn't any space for tell us a funny anecdote about them that has nothing to do with the fact that they vanished. And I think that hope kept coming back into these stories time and time again, just about hope to be given the space to talk about what they wanted to talk about, rather than what we think people should talk about when they're living with a loss.
And how it changes, because even on, we spoke earlier about how it changes over
Yeah.
the years, but even, and what you call the hope hangover, I call the sort of the spiral, because when you get new leads, new information, which may only happen once every, well, it could be once every few months or every few years
Yeah.
even, and you go up because there's
Yeah.
hope that something is going to happen, whether it's, whatever
Yes.
it is. And then, as you say, you hit a brick wall and you have to come crashing down and pick up the pieces and start again. And in the end, that makes you, or makes me, wary of even hoping for
Yes.
anything
I
much.
had
That
I,
when you haven't got any hope, well, if you haven't got any hope, what have you got? And you can't give up hope. So it's a real
It
quandary
is. It is.
sometimes.
One of the participants said, I can remember back in the early stages, once I'd collected all of the data and I was sitting there just surrounded by swirling words, thinking, how am I going to make sense of this to put it actually into 100,000-word thesis and make some sense out of it, but also honour the stories that were told to me. But I can remember one of my supervisors saying, well, what were the things that you found out about hope that you didn't expect? And I said, actually, some of the participants openly said to me, hope is shit. Hope is really crap. And I thought, I don't know how to write that in a very academic way, but it's true that hope equals pain. And one participant
Yeah,
said to me, I don't want my son to come back, actually, now. I don't want to find him. If he's dead, I don't want to find him, because that will open up my heart again, and I just can't go there. It's been 12 years, And I just want to think sometimes perhaps he's out there and perhaps that's enough for me. And if he isn't, then I hope that he's resting. But I've become accustomed to hoping less now, and I just can't be
Yes.
pulled back into that hoping for answers and what that might do for us if we find out what happened to him.
Yeah, you did quote, I think, in your short summary speech that you did when you were presenting your thesis, or maybe I saw it written, but it was from you. It's the hope that hurts, and that really resonated with me because I think, as I've just said, it does become painful sometimes to hope. And like your participant you've just quoted, you almost would rather things stayed as they were, although at the same time you want something to be resolved. So you've got these two sort of feelings vying with each other for priority in your brain and your heart.
Yeah, definitely. And I think something that might be really nice for you to all to talk about at that family forum is what is the difference between your public narratives of hope and where are you allowed to tell your private narratives of hope? Where is it safe to tell those stories? And I didn't really have any participants in the study that said that counselling was useful. It was really just a matter of learning to sit with it and sitting with the unknown, and that this was the ultimate unknown. You know, we all know that life is all unknown. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but that this was the ultimate unknown, and that there were opportunities for personal growth, for people to be able to map and watch how it is that they grew as a result of such a traumatic loss.
Yeah. Well, in summary, what can we say?
I won't say again that hope is shit, but I think in summary, for me, I found that hope was a throwaway concept that was used a lot with missing, that it's very different, that hope in a bereavement context is very different to hope in a missing person's context. What we find in hope and finite death is that when people start to develop hopeful emotions again, then we start to say as grief counsellors that people are coming out of their bereavement phase at that point in time when they're starting to be future oriented and thinking about lovely things in life. And I think sometimes we confuse that the hope that people have when someone's missing is a sign that they're kind of tracking along and going okay. But the very nature of someone going missing means that right from the get-go you start to hope. And I think that the wear and tear on your mind and your heart of that toing and froing of hoping and, you know, the hope hangover and that spiral that you talked about, that can wear people down over a long time, and it stops the open and honest discussions about these types of losses in the community. So I think that's what really stood out for me. And it's also something that I've been trying to share with the police as well, about the fact that they can be hope enablers. They don't have to be hope detractors. They are never going to say anything to families that families haven't imagined themselves. So they don't need to cut down people's hope just because they perceive that enough is enough. They just need to give people permission to be exactly where they're at that point in time.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. And I think what's also amazing is that people like you are doing so much in-depth research on these pretty complex emotional situations which haven't been looked at ever before. So we're very lucky to have you sharing these words with us, Sarah.
I just have to now find another bucket of funding money to continue some work. But that's the ongoing challenge of an academic. But I think I feel like I've just scratched the surface with a lot of these issues, and I think that there's so many more stories that need to be told in order for people to know that that shifting concept of hope is entirely normal.
And we're not alone.
Exactly. And that there's people like me that want to hear the stories and want to write them down. And I think that that's the best that we can do for those people who unfortunately will come next going through those similar issues. So, yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you, Sarah, you've contributed a lot.
Not a problem. Okay, good luck with the forum. Bye.
Bye.